Okay, let's dive into this. We're living in an era completely defined by massive technological disruption, endless streams of data, and just incredibly rapid change. It really feels like to survive in this kind of hyper-complex business environment, you naturally need an equally complex strategy to match it, right? But what if the exact opposite is true? What if in a world that is practically drowning in noise and complication, the ultimate strategic advantage is actually simplicity? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack in today's explainer. It's a really fascinating quirk of human nature, honestly. We instinctively equate things like dense bureaucracy, massive 80-page slide decks, and endless back-to-back meetings with, competence. We just assume that if a solution is simple, it's gotta be naive or under-researched. But this paradox totally tricks us into building these massive organizational labyrinths that actually choke out innovation and completely paralyze our teams. And the cost of all this complexity? It is absolutely staggering. Get this. Over 70% of surveyed executives actually admit that their strategic planning efforts completely lack a systematic approach. 70%. Because of this, their grand plans just turn into these massive, unfiltered laundry lists of initiatives without any real prioritization whatsoever. It's all about doing stuff and very, very little about actually focusing. And this brilliantly illustrates the core conflict we face every single day. On one side, we have the illusion of more. That's that draining, exhausting idea that cramming in more features, stacking up more layers of management, and generating endless frantic activity somehow equals success. But then, on the flip side, we have the reality of less. We're talking absolute clarity, razor-sharp focus, pure speed of execution. It's about doing less, sure, but doing it with incredible precision. Let's move into Section 1, the paradox of complexity, where we'll look at the actual biological and organizational toll this takes. So, executive advisor Esther de la Cruz points out this absolutely brilliant neuroscience insight. When our brains are faced with ambiguity, heavy jargon, and just general cognitive overload, they literally shift into a stress response. And this state actively reduces our cognitive capacity. It fundamentally impairs our ability to collaborate and make good decisions. So that major problem your team is facing during a massive corporate transformation, it isn't a lack of capability. It is quite literally cognitive overload. Complexity is just shutting their brains down. Which brings us to Section 2, hidden decision-making traps. Let's look at what goes wrong in the boardroom. When we're stressed out and overwhelmed, we almost always fall back on predictable biases. We engage in groupthink just to avoid conflict, or we fall into the complexity trap, where simply checking bureaucratic boxes somehow becomes more important than the actual goal. Maybe we stick to the status quo out of pure fear. We anchor our decisions way too heavily on the very first piece of data we happen to hear. Or, my personal favorite, we succumb to the sunk cost fallacy, throwing good money after bad simply to justify a choice we made a year ago. These traps cause leaders to settle for simplistic solutions to really complex problems, or conversely, to radically overcomplicate incredibly simple issues. And the real-world consequences of these traps, they can be devastating. A tragic anchor for this is the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster back in 1986. The decision-makers were under immense pressure, facing ambiguous data about O-ring failures and freezing temperatures, and they completely fell victim to groupthink. The intense pressure to conform, combined with this illusion of invulnerability, suppressed critical dissenting voices. They basically rationalized away the very real risks just to stick to the launch schedule. So the crucial point is that you absolutely have to actively challenge your comfort zones. When you find your organization clinging desperately to a particular process or strategy, you need to stop and ask yourself this question. If this weren't the status quo, would we still choose it? It's a great question, right? Because often we adhere to old ways out of a totally illogical fear of change. We confuse the mere possibility of risk with actual, literal danger. Now, to avoid these traps, we must ruthlessly separate facts from inferences. Imagine walking into someone's house and seeing a giant moose head mounted on the wall. The only actual verifiable fact there is that there is a moose head on the wall. But our biased brains, they immediately jump to inferences. We instantly assume the homeowner is a hunter. But wait, maybe it was left by the previous owner. Maybe it's an inside joke. We have got to stop jumping from plain facts to biased inferences when making business decisions. All right, Section 3, the laws of simplicity. Let's cover some core philosophies here. The absolute foundational tool for any leader dealing with complexity should be Occam's razor. It's this brilliant principle from all the way back in the 14th century, and it basically dictates that we should shave away everything standing in the way of the simplest explanation. Think about it. If you can achieve a goal with just one process, it is entirely superfluous to use three. Albert Einstein captured this delicate balance perfectly. He said, theories should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Because true simplification isn't about just dumbing things down or destroying your value. It's about deliberately removing the excess functionality and the bloat without suffering any major penalty to the actual outcome you're trying to achieve. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we practically apply this. John Maeda, a former MIT professor and tech executive, created this amazing tactical design rule called the shape principle. First, shrink it. Believe it or not, making something smaller actually makes users more forgiving and appreciative. Second, hide it. Conceal those complex secondary functions until they're actually needed, kind of like a Swiss Army knife. And third, embody quality. Use premium materials or high-end messaging so that the simplicity is perceived as an absolute luxury, not some cheap compromise. Moving on to Section 4, Legends of Leadership Simplicity. Let's see this in practice. Look at two of the biggest tech rivals in human history, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Now, despite their vastly different styles, they shared a very critical trait. Neither of them led with convoluted, multi-tiered corporate jargon. No way. They defined a singular, staggeringly simple, forward-looking goals. Gates visualized a PC in every home. Jobs visualized all conceivable music stored right in your pocket. That ultimate, crystal-clear clarity guided literally every immediate step their companies took. Jobs famously understood that strategy is just as much about what you choose not to do. He essentially viewed leadership like being a master gardener. You have to aggressively prune back even the good ideas just to maintain extreme, unrelenting focus. It's all about saying no to 1,000 things so you can say yes to the one right thing. Let's move to and see how this builds across other massive industries as well, where legendary CEOs actively fought corporate bloat. Gary Rodkin at ConAgra slashed a messy portfolio of competing brands to focus on fewer, bigger, better projects. Jack Welch drove GE forward by aggressively demanding speed and simplicity, knowing that convoluted decision-making would literally kill them. Jeffrey Kindler at Pfizer walked in and immediately slashed their bureaucracy down to a maximum of 8 management layers. And Howard Schultz, he famously closed every single US Starbucks for 3 whole hours just to retrain baristas on one simple, foundational task, pulling the perfect espresso. They didn't add layers, they subtracted to find greatness. And that brings us to Section 5, becoming the Chief Simplifier. Let's talk actionable tools for you. First up, you've got to fix what's called the failure to frame. When your team faces a challenge, you need to force them to put the problem into exactly one sentence. And this sentence absolutely cannot imply a solution. It should just start with "the problem is." Creating this mental border around a problem, like a physical frame around a picture, completely prevents mental clutter. It keeps your entire team from brilliantly and successfully solving the completely wrong problem. Next, you want to follow these 3 steps. First, declare simplicity as a core business imperative, not just some passing buzzword. Second, you have to make a dramatic move to prove you're serious, like slashing unnecessary committees or cutting out layers of approval. And finally, make it a hard expectation. Annika Falkengren at SEB Bank literally made simplification a core metric in leadership performance reviews. If her leaders weren't actively simplifying processes, well, their performance scores reflected it, for sure. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. Look, as a leader today, complexity is absolutely inevitable. It's everywhere. But how you react to it, that is a choice. So I want you to ask yourself, in your organization, are you simply managing and organizing the complexity, or are you the one courageously cutting through it? Embrace the power of doing less so your team can achieve so much more.